Imagine you log online, right? And you find this absolutely scathing public review of your life's work.
Oh, that's everyone's worst nightmare.
Truly. And the reviewer calls you, quote, mentally unwell. They accuse you of harboring systemic misogynist, transphobic, and racist views.
Wow. Heavy hitters right out of the gate.
Right. But then they cross the ultimate line. They actually accuse you of promoting human trafficking and pedophilia.
That's just nuclear.
It is. But here is the catch, and this is why we're doing this deep dive today. In this entire barrage, they do not cite a single sentence you actually wrote.
Zero quotes.
Zero. They don't quote a single claim. They offer absolutely zero evidence of your actual positions.
Because they didn't answer what you said. They answered what they decided you are.
Exactly. And today we are unpacking this brilliant analytical essay from thoughtless delineation. It dissects a real-life review that did exactly this.
And just to be clear to you listening, our goal here isn't to gawk at internet drama. We're not doing that.
No, definitely not.
We're trying to decode a hidden blueprint. Because this essay shows how powerful systems silence dissent. And they don't do it by arguing facts. They do it by diagnosing the speaker.
Okay, let's unpack this because the inventory of these charges, it's heavily strategic.
Very much so.
If you look at the specific language of the review, that total lack of evidence, it's actually a feature of the attack, not an oversight.
Right. It's by design. The essay actually breaks these accusations down into two very distinct categories.
Okay, I can lay them out.
So first, you have what the author calls social capital charges. These are the accusations of being racist, misogynist, or transphobic.
Which obviously immediately positions the speaker as an active threat to protected groups.
Exactly. It signals to the audience that this person is quote-unquote unsafe to listen to. It establishes danger, and that activates a very basic social survival instinct.
Yeah, it's like putting a neon biohazard sign on a door so nobody even bothers to check what's actually inside the room.
That is a perfect analogy. But then the review layers on the second category, the disgust charges.
Right. The pedophilia and sex trafficking stuff.
Yes. And those invoke the deepest, darkest social taboos we have as a species. These charges are designed to entirely bypass logic. They trigger a pre-rational nervous system response. They establish contamination.
Contamination.
Sure.
Yeah, I mean, it is a deeply embodied reaction. When you see those words attached to a name, your body physically contracts.
You feel it in your gut.
You do. You feel revulsion before your brain even has a second to process context or ask for proof.
You just want to back away.
Exactly. It's like being in a courtroom, right? Imagine you're a lawyer. You bring out a box of meticulously researched evidence, and instead of reviewing the documents, the opposing counsel just points at you and screams that you're covered in a lethal biological virus.
The jury isn't going to look at your box of evidence.
No. They just want to get away from you as fast as possible.
And what's fascinating here is, if we take that courtroom analogy further, providing evidence would actually ruin the opposing counsel's tactic.
Wait, how so?
Because if the reviewer provided a direct quote from the author, it would invite the audience to use their cognitive faculties.
Oh, right. Because then you're reading and thinking.
Exactly. The audience would have to read the quote, evaluate it, compare the claim against reality. They would have to think.
And pre-rational disgust bypasses the brain entirely.
Yes. By the time an onlooker pauses to ask, where's the evidence, they've already subconsciously backed away from the contaminated source.
The perimeter has been built. The voice is isolated.
It completely suppresses engagement before evidence even becomes relevant.
Which is terrifying, really.
Yeah.
But to understand the motive behind this tactic,
Right.
we have to look at what is actually being protected here.
Right, because the author of this essay wasn't just writing about, abstract philosophy.
No. They were publishing rigorous systemic critiques of the adoption industry.
And to understand why this specific nuclear-level review was deployed against them, we really need to look at how that specific system guards itself.
Yeah, so let's talk about the author's actual work, the work the reviewer completely ignored.
It deals with the brutal structural realities of adoption. We are talking about the economics of intercountry adoption.
Right, where massive financial incentives and agency fees create a demand-driven market for children.
Exactly. And we're talking about how systemic poverty creates vulnerability.
Which is huge,
Yeah.
because coercion isn't always someone holding a weapon to your head.
No, it's often a total lack of social safety nets that forces a mother's hand.
Right, and critically, the author examines how adoption law manufactures the total legal severance of a child from their biological family.
That legal severance is a massive concept.
It really is. We are talking about plenary adoption, where original birth certificates are sealed away from the adopted person by law.
Right.
The state issues an amended birth certificate that literally erases the biological parents. It lists the adoptive parents as if they physically gave birth to the child.
It is the legal falsification of a historical record.
Yes. And the essay introduces a framework to explain how institutions protect these practices. It calls it the architecture of silence.
I love this framework. So the architecture operates on two levels. First, you have the hard tools.
Which are the laws.
Right, the legal and administrative mechanisms you just described. The sealed records, the amended birth records, the binding legal contracts.
They permanently alter the truth of an individual's origins.
Yes. They are the documented machineries of institutional erasure.
Okay, but I have to push back a little here. I struggle with calling societal reactions a tool of an architecture.
How so?
Well, laws are drafted by politicians, right? They're literal, tangible tools. But calling social pressure a soft tool almost implies there's, like, a conscious architect organizing a massive conspiracy against this author.
I see what you mean.
Is the essay really claiming there's a smoke-filled room of villains orchestrating this silencing?
No, and that is a vital distinction to make. It isn't a conspiracy at all. It is a systemic immune response.
An immune response. Okay, explain that.
Well, the hard tools, the laws and administrative barriers, they're actually quite vulnerable on their own. Laws can be challenged in court.
Right. Records can be opened by legislative action.
Exactly. Because the hard tools are visible and debatable, the system desperately needs a second layer of defense. It needs to prevent people from ever looking at the laws in the first place.
Oh, I see.
So the soft tools step in where the law ends. They are the social enforcement mechanisms.
So the soft tools are the cultural narratives.
Exactly.
It's the language of the forever family or the chosen child. It's that societal expectation that demands we view the rupture of family separation exclusively as a beautiful gift.
And this is exactly where we have to talk about honest adoption language, which the author uses.
Yes, because industry language uses terms like gave up for adoption or finding a forever home.
Which centers the comfort of the adoptive parents.
Right. But honest adoption language uses terms like relinquishment, legal severance, and family separation.
It describes exactly what is structurally happening, no romantic overlay.
And when an adoptee becomes an expert on their own experience and uses honest adoption language to analyze their own sealed records.
The system does not engage with their legal analysis.
Yet the soft tools activate.
Exactly. The critic is instantly pathologized. Adoptee experience is treated as a symptom of trauma rather than legitimate expertise.
Right. The system diagnoses the critic as angry, bitter, or unwell.
And that diagnosis creates a severe social cost for speaking out. It plants a massive question mark in the minds of anyone new encountering the adoptee's work.
It makes you ask, is this person mentally stable enough to engage with?
Yes. And that question mark does all the heavy lifting for the system.
Which brings us back to the people actually deploying these tactics, like
All
the
right.
reviewer. Because the essay introduces a second framework here called non-adoptee bias.
Right, the societal default.
Yeah, it privileges the non-adopted perspective as the objective, reliable standard. And within this bias, adoptee testimony is automatically treated as suspect.
Or overly emotional.
Or inherently pathological. Exactly. And look, if you're listening to this and you're not adopted, you likely grew up with a very specific, undisputed cultural script about what adoption is.
It's an exclusive story of love and rescue.
Right. It's adults who desperately want a parent finding children who desperately need parents.
And the author is very careful to note that love and rescue do occur. The love is real.
It is real, but it's an incomplete structural picture.
And that incomplete picture is exactly where the friction happens.
How so?
Well, imagine someone lives entirely inside that non-adoptee framework, and then they encounter a structural critique like an analysis of the power differentials and financial exchanges in intercountry adoption.
It simply doesn't compute as new objective information.
No, it doesn't.
When you bring up structural realities like legal erasure or economic coercion, it registers to them as a direct attack on the love story.
Yes, and because that love story is deeply tied to their understanding of what family even is.
Your critique registers as an attack on parental love itself.
Exactly. It feels like an attack on the moral standing of parents everywhere.
So, if we connect this to the bigger picture, the defensive response of the reviewer, as extreme and baseless as it was, it's an attempt to protect something they hold deeply sacred.
They feel genuine alarm. But genuine feeling doesn't prevent that feeling from serving a structural function?
Right. The reviewer isn't a calculating villain. They are simply the system working through a person to maintain the architecture of silence.
There's a brilliant sociological framing. It moves us past interpersonal drama right into institutional defense mechanisms.
And history is full of this exact tactic.
Oh, absolutely.
The essay points out how political dissidents in the Soviet Union were not engaged in political debate. They were formally diagnosed with psychiatric conditions like sluggish schizophrenia and institutionalized.
Or during the U.S. Civil Rights Movement, Black activists were frequently dismissed by the establishment as emotionally unstable.
Right, or driven by personal pathology, rather than recognized as people with legitimate structural grievances.
The diagnosis is the silencing mechanism.
Yes, and we see that exact same mechanism deployed today against voices dealing with reproductive control, family separation, and systemic coercion.
The essay points out how adoptee activists are routinely dismissed as incapable of objectivity simply because of their lived experience.
Or birth mothers who speak out about the institutional coercion they faced. They're told they're just processing their grief.
Which neatly dismisses their testimony of systemic failure.
Exactly. Or critics of the commercial surrogacy industry being labeled anti-woman to avoid engaging with their questions about the exploitation of economic power dynamics.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. When you look at all of these historical and contemporary examples, you realize what the absolute absence of engagement actually means.
What does it mean?
If the author's arguments about adoption law, financial incentives, or historical records were weak, they would be incredibly easy to refute.
Right. Opponents would simply quote the weak argument, present the counter evidence, and be done with it.
Exactly. That is what actual intellectual engagement looks like.
So the absence of that engagement is the ultimate proof that the arguments are strong.
Yes. They are grounded in law, in history, and in rigorous research. Because they cannot be factually dismantled, the architecture shifts the question.
It forcibly changes the conversation from, is this claim true, to, is this person insane?
Exactly. And once the public is debating your mental state, the substance of what you said becomes entirely irrelevant. The system remains protected.
Wow. So how do you handle this when you are the one challenging power and the system attempts to diagnose you?
Well, the author outlines two common but ultimately wrong ways to respond.
Okay, let's hear them.
The first wrong way is what many well-meaning people will advise you to do. Just dismiss it as a bad faith troll.
Oh yeah, don't feed the trolls.
Exactly. But if you do that, you miss the structural lesson entirely. You treat it as a fleeting personal annoyance rather than studying it as the systemic mechanism it actually is.
That makes sense. What's the second wrong way?
The second wrong way, and this is perhaps the most dangerous trap of all, is to defend yourself.
Wait, really?
Yes. To stand up publicly and declare, I am not crazy, I am not mentally unwell, I am not a danger.
Oh, I see. It's like, okay, imagine a political debate. A candidate is asked about their economic policy, and the opposing candidate suddenly accuses them of being a foreign spy.
A completely wild accusation.
Right. But if the first candidate spends the next 20 minutes frantically presenting their birth certificate and security clearances to prove they aren't a spy.
They are no longer talking about the economy.
Exactly. They have completely abandoned their policy work. They have accepted their opponent's frame.
And in accepting that frame, you have essentially told the audience that your sanity and credibility are actually up for debate.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
The moment you legitimize their premise by arguing against it, the architecture has won.
So what's the solution then?
The post-tragic response, which is what the author advocates for. It requires a completely different kind of discipline.
Tell me more about that.
The post-tragic position is a profoundly grounded way to operate. It means operating after the illusion of fairness has been shattered, but choosing to continue anyway.
It asks you to hold two things at once, right?
Exactly. First, you remain clear-eyed about the harm. Being publicly diagnosed as a danger or mentally unwell carries a very real social and personal cost.
You don't pretend it doesn't sting. You don't paste a falsely upbeat smile over the isolation it causes.
No. But the second thing you hold is agency. You refuse the frame.
Refuse the frame. I like that.
You look at the mechanism, you name it out loud for others to see, identifying it as the architecture of silence, attempting to shift the conversation, and then you return immediately to your work.
Because the work is the answer.
The work is the answer. Every piece of empirical research you publish, every documented truth you uncover.
Every time you use honest adoption language and treat lived experience as objective expertise.
Yes, that is the ultimate demonstration that their accusation is entirely beside the point.
It really is the most vital realization for anyone who finds themselves on the receiving end of these soft tools.
Because if you are being pathologized, if you are being smeared with uncited claims and diagnosed rather than debated,
The accusation itself is evidence of contact.
silence does not write negative reviews.
That is such a powerful takeaway. The architecture of silence doesn't deploy its social enforcement mechanisms against work it considers harmless.
It doesn't need to.
Exactly.
Yeah.
If the system is deploying its soft tools against you, it is because your argument landed.
It means you have named something fundamentally true, and the institution felt the impact.
The smear is not a sign of your failure. It is a sign of your exactness.
It takes the heavy, embodied experience of being smeared and turns it into a map for understanding exactly how power operates.
Because the absence of engagement with your actual facts is exactly where this system reveals its vulnerability. So if you are out there speaking truth to power, look closely at what is missing from the attacks against you. We highly recommend reading the full essay from Thoughtless Delineation. It's an essential masterclass in dissecting institutional power and maintaining your agency.
It really is phenomenal.
And we want to leave you with a final thought to mull over. Think about a time in your own life when you heard someone fiercely criticizing an institution or a system that you personally love and feel invested in.
Just sit with that for a second.
What was your very first instinct in that moment? Did you pause to actually evaluate their facts, their legal analysis, their history? Or did you immediately wonder about their mental health, their personal motivations, or their underlying trauma?
Because if it was the latter,
Ask yourself, was that your own independent, rational thought? Or was that the architecture of silence working through you?